I was sitting in my modest kitchen, stirring a pot of homemade soup with vegetables from my backyard garden, when I heard Marcus laughing in the living room. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, but the sharp, cutting kind that makes your stomach drop. Through the thin walls of my small ranch house, his voice carried clearly as he spoke into his phone. "You should see this place, bro. My mother-in-law's got plastic covers on furniture from the 80s. She's serving dinner on plates she probably got from a cereal box. And get this, she drives a car that's older than my college degree." The laughter that followed felt like a slap across my face. I stood frozen, wooden spoon dripping soup back into the pot, as his words sank in. I swear, if poverty had a smell, this house would be it. But hey, free dinner, right? My hands began to shake, not from age, but from the shock of hearing someone I'd welcomed into my family describe my home, my life, my choices with such casual cruelty. This was Marcus, my daughter Rebecca's husband of 3 years, the man I'd hosted for countless family dinners, the one I'd knitted sweaters for. Last Christmas, the person I'd genuinely tried to love as my own son. I set the spoon down carefully and walked to the kitchen window, needing something steady to hold on to. Outside, my neighbor Mrs. Chen was watering her roses, the same roses I'd helped her plant 15 years ago when her husband passed away. The same garden where we'd shared countless conversations about life, loss, and making do with what you have. Marcus wouldn't understand that kind of wealth, the richness that comes from genuine connections, from knowing your neighbors' names, from building something lasting rather than impressive. The conversation continued in the next room, each word like a needle pricking at wounds I didn't know I had. "Rebecca keeps saying her mom's just practical, but come on, when's the last time she bought anything new? That couch looks like it survived the Great Depression. And don't even get me started on how she clips coupons like it's a full-time job." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I could have bought his entire world twice over and still had money left for lunch. But that story starts long before that phone call. Long before Marcus entered our lives with his expensive suits and dismissive smiles. It starts with a different version of me, one that most people never got to see. My name is Eleanor Walsh, though everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 73 years old, and according to my son-in-law, I'm the poster child for penny pinching. What he sees when he looks at me is a gray-haired woman who buys generic brands, men's clothes instead of replacing them, and lives in a house that hasn't been updated since the Clinton administration. What he doesn't see is the woman who owns more real estate in this city than most developers, including the gleaming 40-story office building where he works as a junior marketing executive. The foundation of my wealth was built on the very principles Marcus mocked. I learned frugality not from necessity alone, but from my grandmother, Rose, who survived the Great Depression and taught me that true security comes from understanding the value of everything and the cost of nothing. Unnecessary. "Ellie," she used to say, stirring her own pot of soup made from whatever vegetables were cheapest that week. "Rich people stay rich by acting poor, and poor people stay poor by acting rich." I was 25 when I bought my first property, a rundown duplex on the outskirts of town. Everyone thought I was crazy. Here I was, a single mother with a 2-year-old daughter, working as a secretary at a law firm, choosing to live in one half of a building that needed everything from new plumbing to a complete electrical overhaul. My parents worried I was in over my head. My friends questioned my sanity. Even Rebecca, too young to understand but old enough to sense tension, would sometimes ask why our house made funny noises at night. But I saw something others didn't. Location. The duplex sat on a corner lot just 3 miles from the university campus, in a neighborhood that was rough around the edges but showed signs of slow, steady improvement. Young professors were starting to buy homes nearby. Coffee shops were replacing liquor stores. The bones of gentrification were already visible to anyone who knew how to look. I spent my evenings after Rebecca went to bed teaching myself about property management, real estate, law, and construction basics. I couldn't afford to hire contractors for everything, so I learned to do what I could myself. I painted walls, refinished hardwood floors that previous owners had covered with shag carpet, and spent countless weekends at the hardware store asking questions until the staff knew me by name. The rental income from the other half of the duplex covered most of my mortgage, allowing me to save aggressively despite my modest salary. Every spare dollar went into a growing fund I mentally labeled as the next one. While other single mothers my age were buying new clothes or going out for dinner, I was clipping coupons and shopping clearance racks, not because I had to, but because every dollar saved was a dollar closer to the next property. 5 years later, I bought my second building, then a third. By the time Rebecca started high school, I owned 6 rental properties scattered across the city, each one chosen for its potential rather than its current appearance. I had developed an eye for seeing past peeling paint and outdated fixtures, to the underlying value that patience and strategic investment could unlock. Rebecca knew I owned rental properties. It was impossible to hide the fact that I sometimes had to deal with tenant calls or maintenance issues. But she never knew the full scope of what I was building. To her, I was simply Mom, the woman who made her lunch every morning and picked her up from school every afternoon, who worked at the same law firm for 23 years and drove the same reliable Honda until it finally gave up at 200,000 miles. The law firm job, while modest in salary, provided something invaluable: access to information. I handled real estate transactions, reviewed property deeds, and filed documents that gave me insight into which areas of the city were being targeted for development. I watched patterns emerge, saw which developers were buying where, and learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a neighborhood was about to transform. When the university announced plans to expand its campus, I already owned 3 buildings in the projected path of growth. When the city approved a new light rail line, I had quietly purchased 2 small apartment buildings near planned stations 6 months earlier. I wasn't insider trading. Everything I learned was part of public records, but I was paying attention in ways that most people don't. My colleagues at the law firm saw me as dependable, quiet Ellie, who brought her lunch in a brown bag and wore the same rotation of conservative blazers year after year. They didn't know that I was analyzing every real estate deal that crossed my desk, building a mental map of the city's growth patterns, and slowly, methodically, positioning myself at the intersection of opportunity and patience. By the time Rebecca graduated from college, my portfolio included 14 properties ranging from small residential rentals to a mid-sized apartment complex. The monthly income from these investments exceeded my salary at the law firm, but I continued working both for the health benefits and because the job still provided valuable market intelligence. Rebecca met Marcus during her first year of graduate school. She was studying social work, drawn to helping families navigate crisis situations, a choice that made me proud beyond words. Marcus was in business school, focused on marketing and brand management, full of big ideas about disrupting traditional industries and creating viral campaigns. From the beginning, I could see that Marcus measured success differently than our family did. Where Rebecca talked about making a difference in people's lives, Marcus talked about making a name for himself. Where I had taught Rebecca to value substance over appearance, Marcus seemed primarily concerned with how things looked to others. Still, Rebecca loved him, and that mattered to me. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I invited them for dinner regularly, always cooking from scratch, always setting the table with my everyday dishes rather than the fine china I kept in the cabinet. I asked about his studies, his goals, his family. I tried to find common ground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Marcus made it clear, in small ways, that he found our lifestyle quaint at best and embarrassing at worst. He would glance around my living room with barely concealed disdain. He would make jokes about my vintage appliances. He once asked Rebecca, within my hearing, why I didn't just upgrade my house if I clearly had some money from the rental properties. What Marcus didn't understand was that my house, modest as it appeared, was exactly what I wanted. I had chosen every piece of furniture carefully, not for its price tag, but for its comfort and durability. The couch he mocked had been in my family for 30 years, and was still more comfortable than anything in the showrooms downtown. The plates he dismissed were handmade pottery from a local artist whose work I'd been collecting since Rebecca was small. After Rebecca and Marcus got married, the dynamic shifted. Marcus began treating my home like a necessary stop rather than a welcome destination. He would check his phone throughout dinner, answer work calls during our conversations, and make subtle comments about how different things were at his parents' house in the suburbs. His parents, Janet and Robert, lived in a sprawling colonial with marble countertops, a 3-car garage, and furniture that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine spread. Marcus would compare everything to their standard: their wine collection, their vacation home, their country club membership. To him, these were the markers of success, the evidence that someone had made it in life. I began to notice how he influenced Rebecca's perceptions too. She started apologizing for my house when they visited, making excuses for the dated wallpaper in the bathroom or the fact that I still had a landline telephone. She would suggest, gently, that maybe I should consider freshening up the place, updating a few things to make it more modern. But I wasn't attached to outdated things out of stubbornness or inability to afford better. Every choice in my home was intentional. The money that Marcus's parents spent on appearances, I invested in assets that generated income while they slept. While they were making payments on luxury cars that depreciated the moment they drove off the lot, I was buying buildings that appreciated year after year. The irony was perfect, though Marcus was too blinded by surface impressions to see it. 3 years ago, when his company needed to relocate to a larger space, they signed a lease for 4 floors in one of downtown's most prestigious office buildings. Marcus bragged about the address, the views, the modern amenities. He posted photos on social media of the sleek conference rooms and the espresso machine in the break room. What he didn't know was that I had bought that building 15 years earlier, when it was still under construction and the developer needed a quick cash buyer to close the deal. It had been one of my largest single investments, requiring me to leverage several other properties and take on more debt than I was comfortable with. But I had seen the plans for the surrounding area, knew that the building would become the centerpiece of a revitalized downtown district. Over the years, as my mortgage payments decreased and rental rates in the building increased, it had become one of my most profitable holdings. The building was managed by a professional property management company, so my ownership remained invisible to tenants. To Marcus, I was just his frugal mother-in-law who saved aluminum foil. He had no idea that every month his company's rent check ultimately made its way into my bank account. I had thought about telling Rebecca about the full extent of my investments, many times over the years. But something always held me back. Perhaps it was my grandmother's voice, warning me about the dangers of flaunting wealth. Perhaps it was my own observation that money changes relationships, often in ways that can't be undone. Or perhaps it was simply that I had grown comfortable with being underestimated, with being seen as harmless rather than powerful. Whatever. The reason I kept my secret, continuing to live modestly while my wealth grew quietly in the background. I drove my reliable but aging car, shopped with coupons, and mended clothes when they tore. I maintained the persona of a careful, frugal woman living on a fixed income, even as my actual income placed me firmly in the category of what most people would consider wealthy. The phone call that evening, Marcus's casual mockery of everything I had built and chosen, was the moment I realized that my secret might need to come to light. Not because I wanted to prove anything to him, but because I was tired of watching him influence Rebecca's perception of what mattered in life. I was tired of being treated like a burden rather than a blessing. And I was especially tired of having my values dismissed by someone who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. As I stood in my kitchen that night, listening to Marcus laugh at my expense, I made a decision. It was time for my son-in-law to learn that appearances can be deceiving, that quiet wealth often runs deeper than loud displays, and that the woman he had been mocking might just hold more power than he ever imagined. The game was about to change, though Marcus didn't know it yet. He was about to discover that his cheap, outdated mother-in-law was actually his landlord, and I was about to show him what real wealth looked like when it decided to stop hiding in plain sight. The evening after overhearing Marcus's phone call, I sat in my favorite armchair, the one he'd once described as something from a nursing home, and reflected on how we'd reached this point. The chair, for the record, was a mid-century modern piece I'd found at an estate sale 20 years ago, reupholstered twice, and worth more than most people's monthly rent. But Marcus saw only the worn fabric and assumed poverty. This pattern of assumption versus reality had defined our entire relationship. When Rebecca first brought him home during their engagement, I had hoped we might find genuine connection. I remember preparing for that dinner with extra care, wanting to make a good impression on the man my daughter loved. I made her favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables from my garden, and set the table with my second-best dishes. Marcus arrived in a suit that probably cost more than some people's monthly mortgage, immediately commenting on how cozy my house was. The word choice felt deliberate, a polite way of saying small and outdated. Throughout dinner, he dominated the conversation with stories about his internship at a prestigious marketing firm, name-dropping clients and projects as if they were credentials for worthiness. When Rebecca excused herself to answer a phone call, Marcus and I found ourselves alone at the table for the first time. I asked him about his goals, genuinely curious about his ambitions. His answer revealed everything I needed to know about his character. "I want to be somebody people notice," he said, cutting into his pot roast with theatrical precision. "Not like the people in my neighborhood growing up, middle class, invisible, just getting by. I want the corner office, the luxury car, the house that makes people stop and stare. I want to matter." I nodded politely, but internally, I felt a chill. Here was a young man who equated visibility with value, who believed that external markers were the measure of a life well lived. It was the opposite of everything I had taught Rebecca about finding fulfillment in purpose rather than perception. "And what about happiness?" I asked. "Do you think those things will make you happy?" Marcus laughed, the same dismissive sound I would later hear echoing through my house during his phone calls. "Happiness is a luxury you can afford once you've achieved success. Right now, I'm focused on building something that matters." That conversation haunted me for months. I watched as Marcus slowly influenced Rebecca's priorities, encouraging her to focus more on career advancement and less on the community work that had always fulfilled her. He would make subtle comments about her choice to work for a nonprofit, suggesting that she was undervaluing herself by helping low-income families instead of pursuing corporate opportunities. Rebecca began to change in small ways. She started apologizing for my house when they visited, as if my choices reflected poorly on her judgment. She would suggest that I treat myself to new furniture or a kitchen renovation, not understanding that I had chosen simplicity over showiness for reasons that had nothing to do with financial limitations. The most painful moment came during their wedding planning. Marcus's parents insisted on hosting the rehearsal dinner at their country club, a lavish affair with more flowers than most people see at a funeral and a menu that cost more per plate than many families spend on groceries. In a week, when Janet, Marcus's mother, asked about my contribution to the festivities, I offered to host a simple brunch the morning after the wedding. Marcus immediately jumped in with suggestions for upgrading my offer. Perhaps I could rent a private dining room at a nice restaurant instead. Or maybe we could hire a catering company to transform my backyard into something more wedding appropriate. The underlying message was clear. My home, as it existed, wasn't suitable for their celebration. I agreed to the catering, not because I couldn't afford something nicer, but because I wanted Rebecca's wedding weekend to be perfect for her. Watching strangers rearrange my garden and cover my patio furniture with rental linens, I felt like I was erasing myself to accommodate someone else's vision of adequacy. The wedding itself was beautiful, held at a vineyard that Marcus's parents selected and largely paid for. I wore a simple navy dress that I'd owned for several years, accessorized with my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only obviously expensive thing I allowed myself to display. Rebecca looked radiant, and that was all that mattered to me. But during the reception, I overheard a conversation between Marcus and one of his groomsmen that crystallized my understanding of how he viewed our family dynamic. They were standing near the bar, drinks in hand, surveying the elegant venue. "Your mother-in-law seems nice," the friend said. "Very down to earth." Marcus snorted. "That's one way to put it. Rebecca's always making excuses for her mom's situation. I keep telling her that once we're more established, we can help her out more. Maybe get her into a decent apartment somewhere, help her upgrade her lifestyle a little." "That's generous of you," the friend replied. "Well, family is family," Marcus said magnanimously, "even when they're stuck in the past." Standing 20 feet away, invisible in my simple dress among the more glamorously attired guests, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about who Marcus was and how he saw me. I wasn't a person to him. I was a problem to be managed, a deficiency to be corrected, an embarrassment to be minimized. That night, I went home to my modest house and sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the rental linens and elegant centerpieces that would be removed the next morning, returning my space to its authentic self. I made a cup of tea in my favorite mug, one Rebecca had given me for Mother's Day when she was 12, decorated with painted flowers and slightly chipped from years of use, and tried to process what I was feeling. I wasn't hurt by Marcus's opinion of my lifestyle. I had chosen every aspect of it deliberately. I was frustrated by his influence on Rebecca, the way he was slowly teaching her to see my choices as inadequacies rather than preferences. But most of all, I was tired of being invisible, of having my values dismissed by someone who mistook expense for worth. Over the following 3 years, the pattern continued. Marcus would visit my home with barely concealed tolerance, making jokes about my vintage appliances and retro decor. He would suggest improvements with the condescending kindness of someone addressing a charity case. And gradually, Rebecca began echoing his suggestions, asking if I needed help updating my living situation. The breaking point came 6 months ago, during what should have been a celebration. Rebecca had received a promotion at the nonprofit where she worked, recognition for her innovative approach to family crisis intervention. I was incredibly proud of her accomplishment and invited them for dinner to celebrate. I prepared Rebecca's favorite meal and bought a small bouquet of flowers for the table. Nothing elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement of her achievement. When they arrived, Marcus immediately began checking his phone, distracted by what he claimed was an urgent work situation. "Sorry," he said, not looking up from his screen. "We just landed this huge client, and they want a presentation first thing Monday. This could be my ticket to senior associate." Throughout dinner, he continued checking messages, barely participating in our conversation about Rebecca's new responsibilities. When I asked about his work, he launched into a detailed description of his latest marketing campaign, clearly more interested in his own achievements than celebrating his wife's. "The office has been crazy," he said, finally putting his phone aside. "We moved to this incredible building downtown, 40 floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, the works. My office looks out over the whole city. It's exactly the kind of place I always imagined myself working." Rebecca smiled proudly at her. Husband's success. But I noticed the way the conversation had shifted entirely to his accomplishments. When I tried to redirect attention back to her promotion, Marcus jumped in with advice about how she could leverage this opportunity to move into corporate social responsibility roles that paid significantly more than nonprofit work. "You're talented, babe?" he said, reaching for her hand. "You could be making twice what you earn now if you just aimed a little higher. My mom knows people in HR at several major companies. I could set up some introductions." The subtext was clear. Rebecca's work helping struggling families was admirable, but ultimately small-scale, less important than the real business happening. In buildings like the one where Marcus worked. Her promotion was nice, but it would be even nicer if she used it as a stepping stone to something he considered more prestigious. After they left that evening, I found myself standing in my kitchen. Again, looking around at the home I had chosen and loved for 43 years. The cabinets that Marcus mocked were solid wood, installed by craftsmen who took pride in their work. The appliances he dismissed as outdated were commercial grade, built to last decades rather than years. The dishes he compared to cereal box. Prizes were handmade pottery from local artists whose work would probably outlive us all. But more than the physical objects, this house contained the life I had built through careful choices and quiet determination. Every room held memories of Rebecca's childhood, of holiday gatherings, of ordinary evenings that had accumulated into a lifetime of contentment. Marcus saw only what wasn't there: the granite countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the designer furniture that would have impressed his friends. That night, I made a decision that had been building for 3 years. It was time for Marcus to understand exactly who he had been underestimating. Not because I needed his approval or respect, but because I was tired of watching him diminish everything I valued while benefiting from wealth he didn't even know existed. The phone call I overheard 3 weeks later, with its casual cruelty and dismissive laughter, simply confirmed what I already knew. Marcus needed a lesson in humility, and I was uniquely positioned to provide one. The humiliation I felt after Marcus's phone call wasn't the sharp, immediate kind that comes from a single cruel comment. It was deeper than that, more insidious. The slow-burning realization that someone had been cataloging your perceived inadequacies for years, storing them up like ammunition for moments when they needed entertainment at your expense. I couldn't shake the image of Marcus sitting in my living room, surrounded by my carefully chosen belongings, describing my life to some distant friend as if it were a museum exhibit of poverty. The plastic furniture covers he'd mentioned with such disdain weren't about being cheap. They protected upholstery that had been in my family for generations. The plates he dismissed were part of a set I'd been collecting piece by piece from estate sales, each one representing a small treasure hunt that brought me joy. But explaining that to Marcus would have been pointless. He had already decided what my choices meant, filtering everything through his narrow understanding of value and status. To him, old meant worthless, simple meant inadequate, and practical meant poor. The next few days passed in a strange sort of suspension. Rebecca called twice, her voice bright with updates about work and plans for the weekend. I listened to her chatter about a new coffee shop they'd discovered, a play they were planning to see, the vacation they were considering for their anniversary. Normal conversation, the kind we'd had hundreds of times before. But now every word felt filtered through the knowledge of what her husband really thought about my life. I found myself analyzing our previous interactions differently, wondering how many times Marcus had bitten his tongue during dinner conversations, how often he'd exchanged meaningful glances with Rebecca when they thought I wasn't looking. Had they discussed my situation in private? Did Rebecca share his embarrassment about my lifestyle? Or was she simply influenced by his constant suggestions for improvement? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. I began second-guessing every memory, every moment when I'd thought we were connecting as a family. Had Rebecca's recent suggestions about updating my kitchen come from genuine concern, or were they Attempts to make me more presentable to her husband's standards? 3 days after the phone call, they came for their usual Sunday dinner. I had considered canceling, claiming illness or fatigue, but decided that would only confirm Marcus's narrative about my limitations. Instead, I prepared the meal with my usual care, making homemade bread and a roast that would have impressed any restaurant in the city. Marcus arrived wearing what I'd learned to recognize as his visiting the in-laws outfit, casual but expensive. Jeans, a designer polo shirt, and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He kissed my cheek with practiced politeness and complimented the smell coming from the kitchen, but I could see him glancing around the living room with that familiar expression of contained distaste. "Smells amazing, Mom," Rebecca said, using the nickname that had always warmed my heart, but now made me wonder if she truly meant it, or if it was simply habit. "What can I do to help?" I assured her everything was under control and suggested they relax while I finished the preparations. From the kitchen, I could hear their conversation, though they kept their voices lower than Marcus had during his phone call. Still, fragments reached me, discussions about his work, their social plans, mutual friends I'd never met. When Marcus's phone rang during the appetizer course, he answered immediately despite Rebecca's gentle protest. "Sorry, I have to take this," he said, already standing. "It's about the Peterson account." He walked toward the back of the house, settling into the small den where I kept my reading chair and television. I tried to focus on my conversation with Rebecca, but I could hear Marcus through the thin walls, his voice carrying that animated tone he used when discussing business. "No, we definitely want the premium package," he was saying. "The location is everything for this campaign. We need people to see our client as sophisticated, high-end. The building itself sends a message about quality and success." Rebecca rolled her eyes affectionately. "He's been obsessed with this new client," she explained. "Some luxury watch company that wants to position itself as the ultimate status symbol. Marcus is convinced this could be his breakthrough project." I nodded and smiled, but internally I was processing the irony. Marcus was orchestrating a campaign about luxury and status from an office in a building I owned, using conference rooms and amenities that my investment had made possible. He was literally profiting from my money while mocking my lifestyle choices. When he returned to the table, 20 minutes later he was practically glowing with excitement. "Sorry about that," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we just locked down this incredible deal. The client loved our proposal for their launch event. We're talking about renting out the entire 40th floor of our building for a party that's going to make headlines." "That's wonderful, honey," Rebecca said, squeezing his hand. "You've worked so hard for this." Marcus beamed, then turned to me with the kind of patronizing enthusiasm usually reserved for children or elderly relatives. "You should see this building, Ellie. It's absolutely stunning. Glass and steel, modern art in the lobby, restaurants on the ground floor. Nothing like the old office buildings downtown that are falling apart." I took a careful sip of my wine, choosing my words deliberately. "It sounds very impressive. What's the address?" 1500 Commerce Street, he said proudly. "Right in the heart of the financial district. Prime real estate. The rent alone is probably more than most people make in a year." My heart performed a small skip, but I kept my expression neutral. 1500 Commerce Street. The address I knew by heart, because I'd been collecting rent checks from that building for 15 years. The building where Marcus worked his demanding job and networked with important clients and felt so proud to have his own office was mine. "The company must be doing very well to afford space there," I said mildly. "We are," Marcus said, missing the subtle irony in my tone. "The agency has really taken off in the past few years. They're expanding, bringing in bigger clients, competing with firms twice their size. Being in that building gives us credibility we couldn't get anywhere else." Rebecca smiled at her husband's enthusiasm, but I caught a flicker of something else in her expression. perhaps slight embarrassment at his obvious pride in material success. She had been raised with different values, taught to measure achievement by impact rather than address, but Marcus's influence was gradually reshaping her perspective. "Mom, you should come see it sometime," Rebecca said suddenly. "Marcus could give you a tour during lunch. It really is beautiful." The suggestion hung in the air like a dare. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and I could see him trying to figure out how to gracefully discourage the idea without seeming rude. The thought of his frugal, embarrassing mother-in-law wandering through his prestigious workplace clearly made him uncomfortable. "That's very sweet," I said, letting them both off the hook, "but I'm sure Marcus is too busy for tours." "Absolutely. Not," Marcus said, his relief masked by over-enthusiastic politeness. "I'd love to show you around sometime, maybe when things slow down a bit." We all knew that sometime when things slow down meant never, but Rebecca seemed satisfied with the gesture. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself studying Marcus with new eyes, watching how he performed the role of dutiful son-in-law while internally cataloging my shortcomings. After dinner, as Rebecca helped me clear the table, Marcus positioned himself in the living room where he could continue his phone conversations about work. I could hear him describing the evening's menu to someone, his tone suggesting that home-cooked pot roast was quaint but ultimately unsophisticated, compared to the restaurant meals he preferred. "The client dinner is Thursday," he was saying. "We're thinking about that new steakhouse on Fifth Avenue. Somewhere impressive, you know? Somewhere that shows we understand quality." Rebecca finished loading the dishwasher and came to stand beside me at the kitchen sink, both of us looking out at the small garden where I grew vegetables and herbs. "Marcus seems really excited about this new project," I said carefully. "He is," Rebecca agreed. "Sometimes I think he cares more about the prestige than the actual work. But he's talented. He'll do well." There was something wistful in her voice, a note of resignation that made me wonder if she was beginning to see the same patterns I'd noticed. Rebecca had always been drawn to meaningful work, to making a difference in people's lives. Her husband's focus on status and appearance seemed to be wearing on her, though she was trying to be supportive. "What about you?" I asked. "Are you happy with your new position?" She brightened slightly. "I love it. We're developing new programs for families in crisis, really innovative approaches to intervention and support. It's exactly the kind of work I always wanted to do." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You should be proud." "Marcus thinks I should consider moving to corporate eventually," she said, her tone neutral but her expression troubled. "Better pay, more opportunities for advancement. He has a point about the financial benefits." I dried my hands on the dish towel, choosing my words carefully. "Money is important," I said, "but so is loving what you do. You've found work that fulfills you. That's rarer than people think." Rebecca nodded, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. Marcus's values were gradually infiltrating her decisions, making her question choices that had once felt absolutely right. He was teaching her to measure success by external markers rather than internal satisfaction, and she was beginning to absorb those lessons despite her better instincts. When they left that evening, Marcus shook my hand with the same polite distance he'd maintained for 3 years. Rebecca hugged me tightly, and for a moment I felt the genuine affection that had always connected us. But as I watched them walk to their car, Marcus's expensive sedan that he'd financed at a payment higher than many people's rent, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. I was no longer just Rebecca's mother who happened to live modestly. I had become a source of embarrassment, a reminder of a lifestyle that Marcus found distasteful and Rebecca was learning to apologize for. My choices were being reframed as limitations, my contentment as resignation, my simplicity as inadequacy. The following week brought an unexpected test of my resolve. Rebecca called on Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a tension I'd rarely heard before. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended. My stomach tightened. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Marcus's parents are coming to visit next month. They want to meet you properly. We've all been together at events, but never really had a chance to talk. They're suggesting we have dinner together, maybe at your house since you're such a wonderful cook. The pause that followed was loaded with unspoken concerns. I could hear Rebecca trying to figure out how to express her worry without hurting my feelings. I think that sounds lovely, I said, though I could already anticipate the complications. The thing is, Rebecca continued carefully, Janet and Robert are, well, they're used to a certain style of entertaining. Very formal, very elaborate. I'm worried they might not understand your approach to hospitality. There it was. The assumption that my approach was somehow deficient, that my way of welcoming people was inadequate compared to the standards set by Marcus's family. Rebecca wasn't trying to be cruel, but she had absorbed Marcus's perspective so completely that she now saw my choices through his lens. What would you suggest? I asked, genuinely curious about how far this had gone. Maybe we could have it catered? Or I could help you redecorate a little beforehand? Nothing major, just freshen things up? I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of what Rebecca was asking. She wanted me to hide who I was, to create a false version of myself that would be acceptable to her in-laws, the woman who had raised her, supported her, loved her unconditionally, was now an embarrassment that needed to be managed. Let me think about it, I said quietly. Of course. And Mom, I'm not trying to change you. I just want everything to go smoothly. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, the same room Marcus had described as resembling a museum of poverty, and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just about differences in taste or lifestyle preferences. This was about fundamental values, about what mattered in life and how we treated the people we claimed to love. I had spent 3 years making excuses for Marcus's behavior, telling myself that he was young, that he meant well, that his priorities would mature over time. But the phone call I'd overheard proved that his disdain wasn't casual thoughtlessness. It was deliberate mockery shared with others for entertainment. More troubling was Rebecca's gradual adoption of his perspective. The daughter who had once been proud of our simple life was now apologizing for it, asking me to hide my authentic self to avoid embarrassing her husband. She was asking me to betray everything I'd taught her about integrity and self-respect. That night, I made another decision. I would host the dinner as requested, but I wouldn't pretend to be someone else. If Marcus's parents found my lifestyle inadequate, that was their limitation, not mine. If Rebecca was embarrassed by her authentic family, perhaps it was time for her to examine why she'd allowed someone else's values to eclipse her own. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep Marcus's influence had gone. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to Rebecca's comments and suggestions, listening for signs of how much she'd internalized his criticism. The signs were everywhere. She mentioned that I might want to consider updating my wardrobe, perhaps shopping somewhere other than the discount stores I'd always frequented. She suggested that my car was becoming unreliable and offered to help me look for something newer. She wondered aloud whether I'd ever considered moving to a more modern apartment, somewhere with updated amenities and better security. Each suggestion was framed as concern for my well-being, but I could hear Marcus's voice behind every recommendation. He had convinced Rebecca that my choices were signs of struggle rather than preference, that my contentment was actually resignation to circumstances. I couldn't afford to change. The most painful conversation came when Rebecca stopped by unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. I had been working in my garden, harvesting tomatoes and herbs for dinner, when she pulled into the driveway. She found me kneeling among the vegetable rows, dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my forehead despite the comfortable temperature. "Mom, you don't have to do this yourself," she said, settling beside me on the garden bench I'd built from reclaimed wood. "There are services that can maintain your yard. You shouldn't be out here working so hard. I looked at my garden, the neat rows of vegetables, the flowering herbs that attracted butterflies, the tomato plants heavy with fruit that would feed me through the fall, and tried to explain what she couldn't see. I enjoy it, I said simply. This garden gives me peace. Every tomato I grow is one I don't have to buy. Every herb I harvest is fresher than anything in the store. It's not work to me, it's satisfaction. Rebecca nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. To her, physical labor was something you paid others to do if you could afford it. The idea that I might choose to dig in the dirt when I could hire landscapers seemed like evidence of either financial limitation or stubborn pride. Marcus says his mother has the most beautiful garden, Rebecca said, apparently not realizing how the comparison would sound. She has a landscaping company that maintains everything. It looks like something from a magazine. I continued harvesting tomatoes, each one warm from the sun and perfect in a way that no store-bought produce could match. Janet's magazine-worthy garden probably cost more to maintain each month than I spent on groceries, but Rebecca had learned to measure beauty by expense rather than authenticity. I'm sure it's lovely, I said, dropping another tomato into my basket. Maybe for the dinner with them, we could have someone come spruce things up. Just trim the hedges, maybe plant some flowers in pots. Something to make the yard look more polished? There was that word again. Polished. As if my garden, which fed me and brought me joy and connected me to the earth, wasn't adequate because it showed evidence of human hands rather than professional maintenance. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees, and looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. She was still the same person I'd raised, still kind and well-intentioned, but she was seeing the world through borrowed eyes. Marcus had taught her to be ashamed of simplicity, to equate authenticity with inadequacy. Rebecca, I said gently, do you remember when you were little, how you used to help me in this garden? You'd plant seeds and water them every day, watching for the first green shoots to appear. You were so proud when we harvested our first tomatoes. She smiled at the memory. I remember. You taught me about patience, about taking care of growing things. Those lessons didn't come from a landscaping service, I said. They came from getting our hands dirty, from learning that the best things in life often require time and effort rather than money. For a moment I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief return of the values I'd instilled in her. But then her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, and the moment passed. She glanced at the message and immediately began gathering her things. I should go, she said. Marcus is leaving work early, and we're meeting friends for dinner. She kissed my cheek goodbye, I caught a whiff of her perfume, expensive, sophisticated, chosen to project an image rather than simply please her own senses. Everything about her was becoming calculated, designed to fit into the world Marcus had decided they should inhabit. After she left, I sat in my garden as the sun set, surrounded by the plants I'd nurtured and the peace I'd cultivated over decades. Tomorrow, I would call my property management company and schedule a meeting. It was time to remind myself of exactly what I'd built while everyone else was focused on what I lacked. The downtown office of Meridian Property Management occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass tower that had been built during the city's economic boom of the early 2000s. I had been working with them for 12 years, ever since my portfolio had grown too large for me to manage effectively on my own. Patricia Hendricks, the senior partner who handled my account, greeted me in the elegant reception area with the warmth reserved for their most valuable clients. Patricia was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my holdings, and she had never once commented on the contrast between my modest appearance and my substantial wealth. "Eleanor, wonderful to see you," she said, leading me toward her corner office. "I have all the quarterly reports ready for your review." Patricia's office overlooked the financial district, providing a bird's-eye view of the buildings that formed the backbone of the city's economy. I could see my own properties scattered throughout the downtown area, including the 40-story tower where Marcus worked his prestigious job. "How's the Commerce Street building performing?" I asked, settling into one of Patricia's leather chairs. "Exceptionally well," she said, pulling up files on her computer. "Occupancy is at 98%, and we've been able to increase rents across the board. The marketing firm on floors 37 through 40 just renewed their lease at a 15% increase." I smiled at the irony. Marcus's company had just agreed to pay significantly more for the privilege of working in my building, money that would ultimately flow into my accounts while he continued to mock my cheap lifestyle. "Any issues with that particular tenant?" I asked. Patricia scrolled through her notes. "Actually, they've been model tenants. Always pay on time, take excellent care of the space, no complaints from other businesses in the building. The principal, a man named Davidson, seems to run a very professional operation." I nodded, filing away the information. Marcus's boss had no idea that his landlord's mother-in-law was the woman his employee described as embarrassingly poor. "What about the apartment complex on Oak Street?" I asked, moving on to other properties. "Also performing above expectations. We have a waiting list for units, and the neighborhood gentrification is driving up property values significantly. Your timing on that purchase was, as usual, impeccable." We spent the next hour reviewing my entire portfolio. The numbers were staggering, even to me. Over the past 3 decades, my careful investments had grown into a real estate empire worth millions. The rental income alone exceeded what most people earned in high-paying careers, and the properties themselves had appreciated far beyond my most optimistic projections. "Have you given any thought to expanding into commercial development?" Patricia asked. "With your capital and our connections, we could explore some very lucrative opportunities." I considered the suggestion. Part of me was tempted by the prospect of new challenges, bigger projects, more visible success. But another part of me was perfectly content with my current situation, financially secure, personally fulfilled, and blissfully invisible to those who measured worth by appearances. "Let me think about it," I said. "For now, I'm satisfied with maintaining what we have." Patricia smiled knowingly. "Of course. Though I have to say, Eleanor, your approach to wealth building is something we study here. Your patience, your eye. For undervalued properties, your willingness to think long-term. It's textbook smart investing." As I left the office and walked back to my modest Honda in the parking garage, I reflected on the strange duality of my life. In this building, among financial professionals and real estate experts, I was respected as a savvy investor with an impressive track record. In my own family, I was seen as someone who needed help upgrading her lifestyle. The contrast would have been amusing if it weren't so personally painful. Marcus worked every day to afford rent in a building I owned, striving for the kind of financial success I had achieved decades ago through the very qualities he dismissed as inadequate. That evening, I called Rebecca to discuss the upcoming dinner with Marcus's parents. "I've been thinking about your suggestions," I said carefully, "and I've decided to host the dinner exactly as I normally would. My home, my cooking, my way of entertaining." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, I just think it would be easier if—" "Rebecca," I interrupted gently. "I've been hosting dinners in this house for over 40 years. I've fed your friends, your teachers, your boyfriends, and countless other guests who all seem to enjoy themselves. If Marcus's parents can't appreciate genuine hospitality because it doesn't come with the right accessories, that says something. About them, not about me." Another pause. "I just don't want there to be any awkwardness." "The only awkwardness will come from people who judge others based on superficial standards," I said firmly. "I raised you to value character over appearance, substance over style. If you're now embarrassed by those values, perhaps we need to examine why." I could hear Rebecca's sharp intake of breath. This was the most directly I had ever challenged the changes in her perspective. The first time I had refused to accommodate Marcus's influence on our family dynamic. "I'm not embarrassed," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I just want everyone to get along." "Getting along doesn't require me to pretend to be someone else," I said. "If Marcus's parents are the kind of people you want me to impress, they should be impressed by warmth, kindness, and genuine care, not by expensive furniture and catered food." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and made a mental inventory of everything I would need for the dinner. Fresh ingredients from my garden, recipes that had been perfected over decades, my grandmother's china that I saved for special occasions. Everything that made entertaining meaningful rather than impressive. The menu would tell a story about my values and priorities. The conversation would reveal my character and intelligence. The warmth of my home would demonstrate the kind of wealth that couldn't be purchased at any price. If Marcus's parents couldn't see value in those things, that was their limitation. And if Marcus and Rebecca were embarrassed by my authentic self, it was time for them to examine whether they were becoming people I had raised them to be. The stage was set for a revelation that would change everything. But first, I needed to let them show me exactly who they had become. The dinner with Marcus's parents was scheduled for a Saturday evening in early October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and my garden was producing its final harvest of the season. I spent the week before their visit maintaining my normal routine, refusing to alter my home or my habits to accommodate their expected preferences. On Friday afternoon, Rebecca arrived unannounced, carrying several shopping bags and wearing the determined expression I remembered from her childhood when she had decided to tackle a project, whether I wanted help or not. "I brought a few things," she announced, setting the bags on my kitchen counter. "Just some flowers for the table, a nice bottle of wine, maybe some candles to create ambiance." I watched as she unpacked her purchases: expensive roses that looked artificially perfect, a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and elaborate candles that belonged in a high-end restaurant rather than a family dinner. Each item was beautiful, but somehow wrong for my home, chosen to impress rather than enhance. "Rebecca, this is very thoughtful," I said carefully, "but I've already planned the table setting. I'm using Grandma Rose's china and the centerpiece I made from vegetables and herbs from the garden." She paused in her unpacking, a slightly pained expression crossing her face. "Mom, I know you love that china, but it's so old-fashioned. And vegetables as a centerpiece? Janet and Robert are used to more sophisticated entertaining." There it was again. The assumption that my choices were inadequate, that my grandmother's fine china was somehow less impressive than whatever modern place settings Marcus's parents preferred. The vegetables and herbs I had planned to use represented the culmination of months of careful gardening, each tomato and bunch of basil grown with attention and care. To Rebecca, they were embarrassing reminders of our modest circumstances. "The china belonged to my grandmother, your great-grandmother," I said quietly. "It's been used for every important family dinner for 3 generations. Those vegetables were grown with my own hands in soil I've been nurturing for decades. They represent something real, something meaningful." Rebecca set down the wine bottle and turned to face me fully. "I know they're meaningful to you, Mom, but this dinner is important to Marcus. His parents' opinion matters to him, and by extension, it matters to our marriage. Can't you just make an exception this once?" I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing Rebecca's face. This woman standing in my kitchen was asking me to hide everything that made me who I was, to present a false version of myself that would be acceptable to people who had already judged me without knowing me. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, keeping my voice level. "Pretend that I'm someone else? Use borrowed dishes to serve food I didn't grow in a house that isn't really mine?" "I'm asking you to meet them halfway," Rebecca said, frustration creeping into her voice. to show them that our family understands quality and sophistication. Our family does understand quality, I replied. We understand that quality comes from authenticity, from genuine warmth, from caring about people rather than impressing them. If Marcus's parents can't see that, perhaps they're not the kind of people whose opinions should matter. Rebecca's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it automatically. The text was from Marcus, and whatever it said made her shoulders tense. "He's bringing them by for cocktails before dinner," she said, her anxiety now clearly visible. "They want to see the house, meet you in a relaxed setting." I nodded calmly, though internally I felt a spark of anticipation. Marcus was bringing his parents to judge my home, expecting to find evidence of the poverty and poor taste he had described to them. Instead, they would encounter a woman who was completely comfortable with her choices and unimpressed by their need for external validation. "What time should I expect them?" I asked. 6:30 for drinks, dinner at 7:30. I mentally reviewed my preparations. The menu was planned around ingredients from my garden and recipes that had been perfected over decades. The house was clean and welcoming without being artificially staged. My grandmother's china was ready, each piece carefully washed and polished. Everything was exactly as it should be for a family dinner hosted by someone who valued substance over show. "It will be fine, Rebecca," I said gently. "Trust me." But as she gathered her expensive props and prepared to leave, I could see that trust was exactly what was missing. Rebecca no longer trusted my judgment, my taste, or my ability to navigate social situations without embarrassing her. Marcus had convinced her that my way of living was somehow deficient, and she had internalized that message so completely that she now saw me through his critical lens. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity that October brings to our part of the country. I spent the afternoon cooking, filling my kitchen with the aromas of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and the herbs I had been drying all summer. The Zayu table was set with my grandmother's china, simple white plates with delicate blue flowers that had graced family celebrations for 70 years. The centerpiece was exactly what I had planned. A wooden bowl filled with the last tomatoes of the season, bunches of fresh basil and thyme, and small gourds I had grown from seeds saved from the previous year. It was beautiful in a way that spoke of abundance earned through patience and care rather than purchased from a florist. At 6:15, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I watched Marcus emerge from his sedan, followed by a couple who could only be his parents. Janet was tall and elegant, wearing what was clearly an expensive outfit and carrying a designer handbag. Robert looked like an older version of Marcus, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any room. Rebecca arrived at the same time, hurrying up the walkway, to intercept them before they reached the door. I could see her speaking quickly, gesturing toward the house in a way that suggested she was managing their expectations, preparing them for what they were about to encounter. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened it with genuine warmth. "You must be Janet and Robert," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Eleanor, but please call me Ellie. Welcome to my home." Janet's handshake was brief and precise, her eyes already scanning the visible portions of my living room. Robert was more effusive, offering compliments about the neighborhood and the autumn colors, but I could feel him cataloging details just as his son did. "What a charming house," Janet said, her tone carefully neutral. "So, lived in." Marcus guided them into the living room, his discomfort evident in the way he avoided meeting my eyes. Rebecca hovered nearby, ready to redirect conversation, if it veered toward topics she considered problematic. "Can I offer you something to drink?" I asked. "I have wine, or I could make cocktails if you prefer." "Wine would be lovely," Robert said, settling onto my sofa, the same one Marcus had mocked for its dated appearance. "Marcus tells us you're quite the cook. We're looking forward to dinner." I poured wine into glasses that, like my china, had belonged to my grandmother. They were simple crystal, elegant in their understated beauty. But I could see Janet comparing them to whatever stemware she used for entertaining. Marcus works in such a beautiful building, I said conversationally, as I handed Robert his glass. 1500 Commerce Street, isn't it? That's one of the most prestigious addresses downtown. Marcus brightened, relieved to be discussing something that showcased his success. It really is incredible, he said. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble lobby, state-of-the-art everything. The agency specifically chose that location because of the image it projects. Image is so important in business, Janet agreed. You want clients to know immediately that they're dealing with successful, sophisticated professionals. Absolutely, Robert added. The building you work in says as much about your company as any marketing campaign. I nodded thoughtfully, sipping my wine. I imagine the rent must be quite substantial for space in such a premium building. It is, Marcus said proudly, but it's worth every penny. Our clients are impressed before they even enter our offices. It gives us credibility we couldn't get anywhere else. And the building management seems quite professional, I observed. Do you know who owns it? Marcus shrugged. Some real estate investment company, I think. We deal with a property management firm for any issues. Meridian something or other. Meridian Property Management, I said helpfully. They have an excellent reputation. The conversation continued in this vein, with Marcus and his parents, discussing the importance of appearances, the value of prestigious addresses, and the way material possessions communicated status to the outside world. Rebecca contributed occasionally, but I could see her growing discomfort with the direction of the discussion. When I excused myself to check on dinner, Janet followed me into the kitchen. Ellie, I hope you don't mind me saying this, she began, her voice carrying the particular tone people use when they're about to offer unsolicited advice. But have you ever considered updating your kitchen? The cabinets are so vintage. I smiled as I basted the chicken, which was browning perfectly in my ancient but reliable oven. These cabinets were installed by craftsmen who took pride in their work, I said. They're solid wood, built to last generations. I've had offers from antique dealers who would pay quite well for them. Janet looked around with new eyes, perhaps beginning to recognize the quality beneath the unfashionable appearance. Oh, I hadn't realized they were valuable. Value is an interesting concept, I said, pulling herbs from the bunches drying by the window. These herbs will season our dinner tonight, but they also represent hours of peaceful work in my garden, the satisfaction of growing something beautiful and useful. You grow your own herbs? And vegetables. Most of what we're having tonight came from my backyard. The tomatoes, the basil, the lettuce for our salad, all grown in soil I've been improving for decades. Janet seemed genuinely surprised, as if the idea of growing one's own food had never occurred to her. That's very industrious. I laughed softly. It's very satisfying. There's something deeply fulfilling about eating food you've grown yourself, about knowing exactly where it came from and how it was tended. When we returned to the living room, I found Robert examining the books on my shelves, while Marcus pointed out various items that he clearly found embarrassing. Rebecca was sitting stiffly in her chair, looking like she wanted to disappear. You have quite a collection, Robert said, gesturing toward my books. I see a lot of real estate investment guides, property law texts, interesting reading material. I've always been curious about how things work, I said. Real estate, finance, economics, they affect all our lives, so I like to understand them. Marcus looked surprised. I didn't know you were interested in that stuff, Ellie. There's quite a lot about me you don't know, I said mildly, a comment that would prove more prophetic than anyone in the room could have imagined. Dinner conversation flowed around topics that revealed the fundamental differences in our value systems. Janet and Robert discussed their recent European vacation, their country club activities, and their plans to renovate their already impressive home. Marcus contributed stories about his work, his ambitions, and his vision for his and Rebecca's future. Rebecca spoke little, contributing only when directly asked questions. I could see her struggling with the contrast between her childhood dinner table, where conversations focused on books, ideas, and community issues, and this performance of material success. Rebecca tells us you've been very supportive of her. Career choice, Janet said as I served dessert. Apple pie made with fruit from my own trees. Though I have to say, nonprofit work doesn't offer much in the way of financial security. Financial security comes in many forms, I replied. Rebecca finds deep satisfaction in her work. She's making a real difference in people's lives. That kind of fulfillment is worth more than money. Robert chuckled indulgently. That's a lovely sentiment, but you can't pay rent with good intentions. No, but you can build a meaningful life with purpose and passion, I said. Money is useful, but it's not the measure of a life well lived. Marcus jumped in, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical direction of the conversation. Of course, financial stability allows you to have more options, more opportunities to make a difference. That's true, I agreed. Financial stability is important, but it's possible to achieve security without sacrificing your values or losing sight of what really matters. The conversation continued in this pattern, with Marcus's family advocating for material success as the primary goal and me quietly defending the importance of authenticity and purpose. Rebecca grew increasingly quiet as the evening progressed, perhaps recognizing how far she had drifted from the values that had shaped her upbringing. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Janet made one final observation that crystallized everything I had been thinking about their family dynamic. Ellie, you have such a unique perspective on life, she said, gathering her purse and wrap. It's refreshing to meet someone who's so content with simplicity. Not everyone can be satisfied with less. The word hung in the air like a judgment, less. As if my choices represented deprivation rather than preference, limitation rather than liberation. Janet meant it as a compliment, but it revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of everything she had witnessed that evening. After they left, Rebecca lingered to help with the dishes, though her movements were tense and distracted. I think that went well, she said finally, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Did you? I asked, rinsing my grandmother's china with careful attention. What did you think of their reaction to dinner? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. They seemed surprised by some things. I think they expected something different. What did they expect? Another pause. I think Marcus may have given them the impression that you were struggling financially. That you needed help, but were too proud to ask for it. I set down the plate I was washing and turned to face my daughter fully. And what impression did you give them? Rebecca's face flushed. I just wanted them to like you, to see how wonderful you are. But you were embarrassed by my house, my dishes, my food. You wanted me to hide who I am to win their approval. I wasn't embarrassed, Rebecca protested, but her denial lacked conviction. Rebecca, your husband has spent 3 years teaching you to be ashamed of the life that raised you. He's convinced you that my choices represent inadequacy rather than intentionality. And tonight, you collaborated in that deception. The words were harsh, but necessary. Rebecca needed to understand how far she had drifted from her authentic self, how thoroughly Marcus had reshaped her perspective. That's not fair, she said, but tears were gathering in her eyes. What's not fair is asking someone to pretend to be someone else to avoid embarrassing you, I replied gently. What's not fair is measuring people by their possessions rather than their character. Rebecca finished drying the last glass in silence, both of us lost in thoughts that we weren't quite ready to share. When she left that evening, she hugged me tightly, but I could feel the distance that Marcus had created between us. The next morning, I made a decision that had been building for months. It was time for my family to understand exactly who they had been underestimating, Time for Marcus to learn that his cheap mother-in-law was far more successful than he had ever imagined. I called Patricia at Meridian Property Management and scheduled a meeting for Monday morning. Then I made a list of phone calls that would set in motion the revelation that would change everything. The first call was to my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled my real estate transactions for 20 years. "James, I need you to prepare some documents for me," I said. "Complete portfolio summary, property valuations, income statements for the past 5 years. I want everything on official letterhead." "Is this for tax purposes?" he asked. "No," I said, looking out at my garden where the last tomatoes were ripening in the autumn sun. "It's for education purposes. I think it's time my family learned exactly what I've been building all these years." The second call was to my accountant, requesting similar financial documentation. The third was to Patricia, asking her to compile a detailed report on all my properties, including the specific lease agreements for the tenants in my Commerce Street building. By Wednesday, I had assembled a complete picture of my financial situation, documents that would shock anyone who assumed my modest lifestyle reflected limited resources. The numbers were staggering even to me, representing 30 years of careful investment and patient wealth building. But before I revealed anything to my family, I wanted to give Marcus one final opportunity to show his true character. I wanted to see exactly how far his contempt would go when he thought no one was listening. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That Thursday evening, Rebecca called to say they would be stopping by after dinner to drop off some books she had borrowed. When they arrived, Marcus was in the middle of what sounded like an important phone call. "I'll just be a minute," he said, stepping onto my back porch to finish his conversation. Through the open window, his voice carried clearly into the kitchen, where Rebecca and I were making tea. "Trust me, you would not believe this place," he was saying, apparently describing his evening to a friend. "We're talking about plastic slipcovers, china from the 1950s, and vegetables as table decorations. It's like visiting a museum of poverty." Rebecca froze, tea kettle in hand, finally hearing her husband's true opinion of our family expressed, in his own words. "And get this," Marcus continued, "she thinks she's some kind of financial genius because she owns a few rental properties. My mother-in-law thinks she understands real estate because she owns some rundown apartments. It's actually kind of sad." I saw Rebecca's face change as she listened, watching her husband mock the woman who had raised her with love and sacrifice. The scales were falling from her eyes, and she was finally seeing Marcus as I had seen him for 3 years. "The worst part is how Rebecca defends her," Marcus went on. "She actually thinks her mother's lifestyle is charming instead of embarrassing. I keep trying to help her see that we could do better for the old lady, get her into a decent apartment somewhere, but Rebecca has this misplaced loyalty." The phrase "old lady" hit Rebecca like a physical blow. I could see her hands shaking as she set down the kettle, finally understanding the depth of her husband's disrespect. When Marcus returned from his call, he found us sitting at the kitchen table in pointed silence. If he noticed the tension, he didn't acknowledge it. "Sorry about that," he said casually. "Just coordinating some details for tomorrow's client presentation." Rebecca stood abruptly, her movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "We should go," she said, not looking at either of us. Marcus seemed confused by her sudden urgency, but he followed her toward the door. Rebecca hugged me at the threshold, whispering "I'm sorry" so quietly that only I could hear it. After they left, I sat in my living room and felt the pieces of my plan falling into place. Marcus had shown his true character one too many times, and Rebecca had finally witnessed it firsthand. The stage was set for a revelation that would reshape our entire family dynamic. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing them exactly who I really was. And Marcus would learn that the old lady he had been mocking owned the very building where he worked his prestigious job, that his cheap mother-in-law was wealthier than his entire family combined. The revelation would be devastating for him and educational for everyone else. But most importantly, it would force Rebecca to choose between the values that had shaped her and the superficial priorities that Marcus had been teaching her to embrace. The game was about to change forever. Friday morning, I made the call that would set everything in motion. "Patricia," I said, "I need you to send a formal notice to all tenants in the Commerce Street building. Nothing dramatic, just a standard. Communication from the property owner introducing myself. Include my full name and contact information." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Eleanor, you've never wanted direct contact with tenants before. May I ask why the change in policy?" I smiled, looking out at my garden where the morning sun was illuminating the last flowers of the season. "Let's call it a family matter that requires some clarification. Of course, I'll have the notices delivered today." The notice would be simple and professional, nothing more than a brief introduction from Eleanor Walsh, owner of the building, expressing appreciation for quality tenants and providing contact information for any concerns. But for Marcus, it would be the shock of a lifetime. By Monday morning, every tenant in the building would know exactly who owned their prestigious workspace, including the junior marketing executive on the 37th floor, who had spent 3 years mocking his landlord's mother-in-law without realizing they were the same person. The revelation was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. I woke before dawn, as had become my habit over the decades, and made my coffee in the kitchen that Marcus found so embarrassingly outdated. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning to reshape his entire world using the same methodical approach that had built my wealth: patience, timing, and strategic action. By 8:30, Patricia would have delivered the tenant notices to every office in my Commerce Street building. The simple, professional letter would reach Marcus's desk along with hundreds of others. But for him, it would be the moment when his carefully constructed narrative about his poor mother-in-law would begin to crumble. I spent the morning tending to my garden, harvesting the last of the fall vegetables and preparing the beds for winter. There was something deeply satisfying about working with my hands while knowing that across the city, my identity as a property owner was being revealed to the man who had spent 3 years mocking my lifestyle choices. At 10:15, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Rebecca's number, but when I answered, I could immediately tell something was wrong. "Mom." Her voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I set down my gardening tools and walked to the kitchen table, settling into the chair where I had made so many important decisions over the years. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "Marcus just called me from work. He's very upset. He says he received a letter today from the owner of his building, a woman named Eleanor Walsh." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. This was Rebecca's moment to connect the dots, to understand the full scope of what she had been blind to for so long. "Mom, is there something you haven't told me? About your finances, your investments, your situation?" The word situation hung between us like a bridge she was afraid to cross. I could hear the confusion in her voice, the dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about her mother might be incomplete. "What exactly is Marcus upset about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "He says the letter came from the building owner, introducing herself to the tenants. He says the woman has the same name as you, lives in the same neighborhood. He's convinced it's some kind of coincidence, but he seems rattled." I smiled, imagining Marcus trying to reconcile his image of his poor mother-in-law with the possibility that she might own the prestigious building where he worked. His mind would be racing, searching for explanations that didn't challenge his fundamental assumptions about wealth and appearance. "Rebecca, why don't you and Marcus come over for dinner tonight? I think it's time we had a conversation about some things I haven't shared with you." The pause that followed stretched so long I thought we might have been disconnected. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Mom, what aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you to come to dinner," I said gently. 7 o'clock, just the three of us. And Rebecca, tell Marcus to bring that letter with him. After. We hung up. I sat in my quiet kitchen and allowed myself a moment of anticipation. Tonight would be the end of Marcus's casual cruelty, the end of Rebecca's misplaced shame about our family, and the beginning of a new dynamic based on truth rather than assumptions. I spent the afternoon preparing what would be the most important meal I had ever cooked. Not because the food was elaborate. I chose simple, elegant dishes that showcased ingredients from my garden, but because it would be served alongside revelations that would forever change how my family saw me. The menu was deliberately symbolic. Fresh pasta made from scratch, tossed with herbs I had grown and preserved myself. Roasted vegetables that represented the fruits of my labor, both literal and metaphorical. And for dessert, a cake made from my grandmother's recipe, the same woman who had taught me that true wealth was built quietly, steadily, without fanfare or display. As I cooked, I thought about the documents I had assembled over the past week. Financial statements that showed my net worth in stark, undeniable numbers. Property deeds that listed my name as owner of buildings throughout the city. Lease agreements. That would prove Marcus had been paying rent to me for 3 years without knowing it. The evidence was overwhelming, but I wasn't planning to present it as an attack. Instead, I wanted to use this moment to teach my family about the difference between wealth and affluence, between security and display, between substance and show. At 6:45, I heard Marcus's car in the driveway. Through the window, I watched them walk toward the house, Rebecca's movements tense with anxiety, Marcus's posture rigid with whatever emotions he was struggling to contain. He was carrying a manila folder that undoubtedly contained the letter that had shaken his worldview. When I opened the door, Marcus looked different than I had ever seen him. Gone was the confident, slightly condescending smile he usually wore, in my presence. Instead, his face showed confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been fear. "Hello, you two," I said warmly. "Come in. Dinner's almost ready." Rebecca hugged me with unusual intensity, as if she were trying to read my secrets through physical contact. Marcus shook my hand with formal politeness, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, leading them into the living room that Marcus had so often criticized. "Mom," Rebecca said, settling onto the edge of my vintage sofa, "we need to talk about this letter Marcus received." I nodded and sat across from them in my favorite armchair, the one Marcus had once compared to nursing home furniture. "Of course. But first, let's have dinner. Some conversations are best had over a good meal." Marcus looked like he wanted to protest, but Rebecca placed a restraining hand on his arm. They followed me to the dining room, where I had set the table with my grandmother's china and simple cloth napkins that had been in our family for decades. The meal proceeded with stilted conversation about work, weather, and everything except the elephant in the room. Marcus barely touched his food, his eyes occasionally darting to the manila folder he had placed beside his chair. Rebecca ate mechanically, clearly struggling with questions she didn't know how to ask. Finally, as I served dessert, Marcus could contain himself no longer. "Ellie, I need to ask you about something." He reached for the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. "I received this letter at work today, and I'm hoping you can help me understand something." He pulled out a single sheet of letterhead and placed it on the table between us. The Meridian Property Management logo was clearly visible at the top, along with the formal language Patricia had crafted to introduce the building's owner to her tenants. "The letter is signed by someone named Eleanor Walsh," Marcus continued, his voice carefully controlled. "It says she owns our building. Now, I know that's your name, and I know you live in this neighborhood, but obviously there's been some kind of mistake or confusion." I picked up the letter and read it slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. The language was professional and straightforward. A brief introduction from the property owner, expressing appreciation for quality tenants and providing contact information for any concerns. "This is a very nice letter," I said, setting it back on the table. "Very professional. What kind of confusion do you think there might be?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Well, obviously it's not you. I mean, you don't own commercial real estate. You live in this house, you work at a law firm, you're—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insulting. "You're not in the position to own buildings like that." Rebecca was watching this exchange with growing alarm, beginning to understand that her husband's certainty might be misplaced. "What position would that be?" I asked mildly. "I just mean, financially speaking," Marcus said, his discomfort becoming more apparent. "Buildings like that cost millions of dollars. The rent alone for our 4 floors is probably more than most people make in a year." I nodded thoughtfully. "You're right about the cost. Commercial real estate is quite expensive. Tell me, Marcus, how much does your company pay in rent each month?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I don't know the exact amount. Why?" "I'm curious about the numbers. Rebecca, would you help me clear the dessert plates?" "Marcus, perhaps you could join us in the kitchen. I have something to show you both." They followed me into the kitchen, where I had arranged several manila folders on the counter next to my coffee maker. Each folder was labeled and organized with the precision I had learned during my decades at the law firm. "Before we discuss this letter," I said, pouring coffee into 3 cups, "I think it's important for you both to understand some things about my financial situation that I haven't shared with you." I opened the first folder and removed a document that Patricia had prepared, a complete list of my properties with their current market valuations. The numbers were staggering, even in the context of today's inflated real estate market. Rebecca gasped audibly as she scanned the list. 14 properties ranging from small residential rentals to major commercial buildings, with a combined value that placed me firmly in the category of millionaire several times over. Marcus stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. His face had gone pale, and he seemed to be struggling to process what he was seeing. "I don't understand," Rebecca whispered. "Mom, where did all this come from?" I opened the second folder, revealing financial statements that showed 3 decades of steady investment growth, monthly rental income that exceeded most people's annual salaries, asset appreciation that had compounded year after year into genuine wealth. "It came from the same principles your grandmother taught me," I said quietly. "Patience, careful planning, and the discipline to live below my means while investing for the future." "But you work at a law firm," Rebecca said, still trying to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew. "You drive an old car, you shop with coupons, you live in this house." "I choose to work at the law firm because I enjoy it and because it provides excellent health insurance," I explained. "I drive a reliable car because I don't need to impress anyone with my transportation. I shop carefully because wasting money has never made sense to me, regardless of how much I have." Marcus found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Are you saying you actually own my building?" I opened the third folder and removed a deed that bore my name as the owner of 1500 Commerce Street, along with lease agreements that showed his company as one of my tenants. "I've owned that building for 15 years, I said simply. "I bought it when it was still under construction, before your company ever moved in." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stared at the documents as if they might disappear if he looked away. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. "For 3 years," I continued, my voice gentle but firm, "you've been paying rent to me while telling your friends how poor and embarrassing your mother-in-law is. You've mocked my lifestyle, criticized my choices, and encouraged Rebecca to be ashamed of the family that raised her." Marcus's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, I interrupted. I heard you, Marcus. Multiple times. On the phone, during conversations you thought I couldn't hear. You've described my home as poverty-stricken, my possessions as worthless, my values as outdated. Rebecca turned to stare at her husband, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. You said those things? Rebecca, you don't understand the context, Marcus began, but I held up a hand to stop him. The context is very clear, I said. You've spent 3 years trying to convince my daughter that I'm an embarrassment she needs to manage rather than a mother she can be proud of. You've judged me based on appearances while remaining completely ignorant of the reality of my situation. I opened the 4th folder, revealing bank statements that showed monthly deposits from Meridian Property Management. The amounts were substantial, representing rental income from all my properties, but the deposits from the Commerce Street building were clearly marked and easily identifiable. Every month, I said, pointing to the relevant line items, your company's rent check makes its way into my bank account. You've been literally paying my bills while complaining about my cheap lifestyle. Marcus sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs, the same chairs he had dismissed as outdated furniture. His entire worldview was collapsing, and I could see him struggling to rebuild his understanding of everything he thought he knew. Why didn't you tell us? Rebecca asked, her voice small and confused. Because I wanted to see who you would become without the influence of my money, I said honestly. I wanted to know if you would value character over wealth, substance over show. I wanted to see if the values I taught you were strong enough to withstand pressure to conform to other people's expectations. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. And I failed that test, didn't I? You got lost for a while, I said gently. But that doesn't mean you can't find your way back. Marcus finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. How much are you worth? I opened the final folder, revealing a net worth statement that my accountant had prepared. The number at the bottom was larger than Marcus's annual salary multiplied by several decades. Enough to buy your company's building several times. Over, I said simply. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever earning another dollar. Enough to help my family if they needed it. Though I've learned that sometimes helping too much prevents people from developing their own strength. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock that had marked time in my home. For 40 years. Marcus stared at the financial documents as if they were evidence of his own failure, which in many ways, they were. I need to apologize, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I've been terrible to you, condescending, judgmental, cruel. I had no idea. Would your behavior have been different if you had known? I asked. Should respect be contingent on someone's bank balance? The question hung in the air, forcing Marcus to confront the shallowness of his value system. If he had treated me badly because he thought I was poor, what did that say about his character? And if he would only treat me well now that he knew I was wealthy, what did that say about his capacity for genuine respect? You're right, he said, his shoulders sagging. My behavior was inexcusable regardless of your financial situation. I treated you badly because I thought you were beneath me somehow. And that's not the kind of person I want to be. Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, I'm so sorry. I got caught up in trying to fit into Marcus's world, and I lost sight of everything you taught me about what really matters. I squeezed her hand gently. The question now is what you're going to do with this knowledge. How will it change the way you see yourselves, your priorities, your goals? Marcus looked up from the documents, his face showing genuine remorse. I don't know how to make this right. I've been paying rent to you while insulting you behind your back. I've influenced Rebecca to be ashamed of her own mother. I've been everything I was raised not to be. You can start by remembering this moment, I said. Remember how wrong your assumptions were, how your judgments were based on superficial observations rather than actual knowledge. Remember that worth isn't measured by possessions, and that character is demonstrated by how we treat people we think can't benefit us. I stood and began clearing the coffee cups, giving them both time to process what they had learned. The revelation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Marcus would have to rebuild his understanding of success and status. Rebecca would have to choose between the values that had shaped her childhood and the materialistic priorities she had recently adopted. "There's one more thing," I said, returning to the table with a fresh pot of coffee. "This building you work in, this prestigious address you're so proud of, I didn't buy it to impress anyone. I bought it because I saw potential for steady rental, income, and long-term appreciation. The prestige you value so highly was just a side effect of good business sense." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand that my wealth hadn't been built through the pursuit of status symbols, but through the application of principles he had dismissed as old-fashioned. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "Now you both decide who you want to be going forward," I said. "Do you want to continue measuring success by external markers, or do you want to focus on building something meaningful? Do you want to chase other people's approval, or do you want to develop the confidence that comes from knowing your own worth?" Marcus cleared his throat. "Ellie, would you be willing to teach me about investing, about building wealth the way you did? I realize I have a lot to learn about what actually matters." I smiled, seeing genuine humility in his expression for the first time since I had known him. "I'd be happy to share what I've learned, but the most important lesson isn't about money. It's about character. Wealth without integrity is just expensive emptiness." As the evening concluded and they prepared to leave, I could see that both Rebecca and Marcus were struggling to process the magnitude of what they had discovered. Their understanding of their family dynamics, their values, and their own identities had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single dinner conversation. "Mom," Rebecca said as I walked them to the door, "I need you to know that I love you for who you are, not for what you own. I'm sorry it took this revelation for me to remember that." I hugged my daughter tightly, feeling the genuine emotion in her words. "I love you too, sweetheart. Both of you. That's why I needed you to see past the surface, to understand that wealth and worth aren't the same thing." Marcus extended his hand, then seemed to think better of it, and asked if he could hug me instead. "Thank you for teaching me something I should have learned long ago," he said. "About respect, about assumptions, about what really matters." As they drove away, I stood in my doorway and looked out at the neighborhood I had called home for over 4 decades. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to work in my building with a completely different understanding of his place in the world. Rebecca would have to decide whether to continue down the path of materialism or return to the values that had once guided her decisions. The revelation was complete, but the real transformation was just beginning. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from what we gain, but from having our assumptions stripped away, leaving us to rebuild our understanding on a foundation of truth rather than appearances. I closed the door and returned to my kitchen, where the documents that had shattered Marcus's worldview were still spread across the counter. Tomorrow I would return them to their files, but tonight I would savor the satisfaction of a lesson well taught and a family dynamic forever changed. The game wasn't just changing, it had been completely reset, with new rules based on reality, rather than misconceptions. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like the mother and grandmother I had always been, respected for my wisdom rather than pitied for my perceived limitations. The silence that had been my strategy was finally broken, and the truth had set us all free. The weeks following our dinner conversation brought changes that rippled through our family like stones dropped into still water. Marcus returned to work the next morning with a completely altered perspective on the building where he spent his days. Every elevator ride to the 37th floor reminded him that he was ascending through property owned by the woman he had mocked. Every rent check his company wrote was ultimately a payment to his mother-in-law. Rebecca called me 3 days after the revelation, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything you showed us," she said. "About your investments, your approach to money, your choices. I want to understand how you did it, how you built something so substantial while living so simply." I smiled, settling into my reading chair with a cup of tea. Understanding comes from looking at the long view rather than immediate gratification. Every decision I made was based on asking myself what would matter in 10 years, not 10 minutes. "Could you teach me? Could we spend some time going through your strategy, your philosophy?" The request touched something deep in my heart. For 3 years, Rebecca had been pulling away from the values I had tried to instill in her, influenced by Marcus's emphasis on appearance over substance. Now she was voluntarily seeking to reconnect with principles that could guide her toward genuine security and fulfillment. "I would love that," I told her. "But first, you need to decide what kind of life you want to build. Do you want to accumulate wealth to impress others, or do you want to create financial independence that allows you to pursue what truly matters to you?" Our first lesson took place the following Saturday morning in my kitchen, surrounded by the financial records that had shocked her just days earlier. I started with the basics: how I had identified undervalued properties, how I had calculated potential returns, how I had balanced risk with reward. "The secret isn't finding perfect investments," I explained, showing her the records from my early purchases. "It's finding good investments and having the patience to let them grow. This duplex I bought when you were 2, it seemed like a huge risk at the time, but I held on to it for 30 years. The monthly rent has tripled, and the property is worth 10 times what I paid for it." Rebecca studied the numbers with the same intensity she had once applied to her social work cases. "You were making long-term decisions while raising me alone and working full-time. How did you manage all of it?" "By keeping my priorities clear," I said. "You were always first. Everything else was built around ensuring you had what you needed while positioning us for future security. I didn't buy investment properties to get rich quickly. I bought them to ensure we would never be vulnerable." As we worked through my portfolio piece by piece, Rebecca began to understand the philosophy that had guided my decisions. Every purchase had been carefully researched, every renovation strategically planned, every tenant screening conducted with thorough attention to detail. "It's like you built a parallel career," she observed, reviewing the management logs I had kept for decades. "In many ways I did," I agreed, "but it was a career built on my terms, at my pace, with goals that aligned with my values rather than someone else's expectations." Marcus's transformation was more dramatic and more difficult to watch. He arrived at my house the following weekend carrying a notebook and wearing an expression of determined humility that seemed foreign on his features. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, settling carefully onto my sofa. "About character and assumptions. I realized I need to completely reevaluate how I measure success, how I treat people, how I define my own worth." He opened his notebook, revealing pages of handwritten questions and observations. "I've been making lists of every assumption I made about you, every judgment I passed based on superficial observations. The list is longer than I want to admit." I could see genuine remorse in his manner, but also something deeper, a recognition that his entire value system had been built on unstable foundations. "Tell me about your goals," I said. "Not the ones you think you should have, but the ones that actually matter to you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with a question he had never seriously considered. "I want Rebecca to be proud of me," he said finally. "Not because of where I work or what I own, but because of who I am. And I want to build something meaningful rather than just pursuing status. It was a beginning. Over the following months, Marcus began the difficult work of examining his priorities and rebuilding his relationship with our family on a foundation of genuine respect rather than superficial politeness. The changes in their marriage were subtle, but significant. Rebecca began pushing back against Marcus's tendency to measure everything by external standards. She declined invitations to events that felt performative rather than enjoyable. She started suggesting activities that focused on experience rather than expense. "We went hiking last weekend," she told me during one of our regular phone calls. "Just the two of us, with sandwiches I made and water bottles from home." Marcus said it was the most relaxed he'd felt in months. The shift wasn't always smooth. Marcus struggled with ingrained habits of comparison and status seeking. During a family dinner in November, he caught himself criticizing a restaurant for being too casual before stopping mid-sentence and apologizing. "I'm still learning," he said, looking embarrassed by his own comment. "These patterns are harder to break than I expected." "Changing your perspective is like learning a new language," I told him. "It takes practice and patience, and you'll make mistakes. The important thing is recognizing them and choosing to do better." Meanwhile, my relationship with Rebecca deepened in ways I hadn't experienced since her childhood. Our regular lessons about investing and money management evolved into broader conversations about life philosophy, career choices, and relationship dynamics. "I've been thinking about my work," she said during one of our Saturday morning sessions, "about why I chose social work in the first place, and whether I'm still honoring those original motivations." I poured more coffee and waited for her to continue, having learned that the most important conversations often required space for reflection. When I started, I wanted to help families navigate crisis situations because I remembered how alone we felt sometimes when I was growing up. Not financially, I realize now we were never actually struggling, but emotionally, the sense that we were on our own, that we had to be strong enough to handle whatever came. Her insight touched me deeply. I had worked so hard to provide financial security that I hadn't realized she had internalized some of my emotional independence as isolation. "I never wanted you to feel alone," I said gently. "If I gave you that impression, I'm sorry." "You didn't," she assured me quickly. "You taught me resilience and self-reliance. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking that asking for help was a sign of weakness. When I met Marcus, his confidence and success felt like protection from that vulnerability. It was a moment of clarity that explained so much about her attraction to Marcus's material success and her gradual adoption of his values. She had been seeking security in external validation rather than drawing on the inner strength I had tried to cultivate in her. "True security comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes," I said. "Not from having someone else handle it. For you." As winter settled into spring, the dynamics of our family continued to evolve. Marcus began seeking my advice on career decisions, asking questions about long-term planning versus short-term gains. Rebecca started volunteering with financial literacy programs, teaching other young women about investment strategies and money management. The most significant change came in April, when Marcus received an offer to join a larger marketing firm, with a substantial salary increase and impressive benefits package. "It's everything I thought I wanted," he told us during dinner at my house. "Corner office, prestigious clients, company car, the works. But I keep thinking about what you said about meaningful work versus impressive work." "What's meaningful to you?" I asked. "Honestly, I've enjoyed the pro bono work we've done for local nonprofits more than any of the luxury brand campaigns. Helping organizations that actually make a difference feels more satisfying than selling expensive watches to people who already have everything." Rebecca reached for his hand across my dining table. "Then that's your answer." Marcus declined the prestigious offer and instead negotiated to expand his firm's nonprofit division, taking a role that paid less but aligned better with his evolving values. His parents were mystified by the decision, but I could see the relief in his face when he talked about his new responsibilities. "I'm working with organizations that provide housing for homeless families," he told me with genuine enthusiasm. "Real estate development for social good rather than maximum profit. It feels like I'm actually contributing something positive to the world." As summer arrived, I found myself reflecting on the journey our family had taken over the past year. The revelation of my wealth had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had come from the difficult work of examining assumptions, questioning priorities, and choosing authenticity over appearance. Rebecca and Marcus's marriage had grown stronger as they learned to base their relationship on shared values rather than shared aspirations for status. They spent more time in my garden, helping with the harvest and learning to appreciate the satisfaction of growing their own food. "I understand now why you choose to live this way," Rebecca said one evening as we picked tomatoes together. "It's not about the money you save or the impression you make. It's about staying connected to what's real." The garden had become a metaphor for everything I had tried to teach them about patience, nurturing, and finding joy in simple pleasures. Marcus, who had once mocked my vegetable centerpieces, now took pride in helping me plan next year's plantings. In August, they announced that they were expecting their first child. Rebecca's eyes shone with excitement as she shared the news, but I could also see the weight of responsibility settling on both of them. "We want to raise this baby with the values you taught me," she said. "Real values, not the superficial stuff we got caught up in. That means making intentional choices about what kind of life you want to model," I told them. "Children learn more from what they see than what they're told." As autumn returned and I prepared my garden for another winter, I felt a deep satisfaction. That had nothing to do with my financial portfolio and everything to do with the relationships I had nurtured back to health. Marcus had become the son-in-law I had always hoped for, respectful, thoughtful, and genuinely caring rather than performatively polite. He sought my guidance not because he needed my money, but because he valued my perspective and experience. Rebecca had reconnected with her authentic self, finding a balance between ambition and contentment that allowed her to pursue meaningful work without sacrificing her principles. On a crisp October evening, as we sat around my kitchen table sharing a meal made from vegetables we had grown together, Marcus raised his glass in a toast. "To Ellie," he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had once characterized his interactions with me. "For teaching us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, and that real respect has to be earned through character, not purchased through status." Rebecca clinked her glass against his and then mine. "And for showing us that patience and principle always triumph over pretense and performance." I looked around my table, the same table where Marcus had once made calls mocking my lifestyle, where Rebecca had apologized for my simple hospitality, where I had served countless meals to a family that had forgotten how to see me clearly. Now it was surrounded by people who understood that my choices reflected strength rather than limitation, wisdom rather than inadequacy, love rather than poverty. "The greatest wealth," I said, raising my own glass, "is having people in your life who see your true value. Everything else is just numbers on a page." As the evening wound down and they prepared to return to their own home, a modest apartment they had chosen for its character rather than its address, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The revelation of my property, ownership had shocked them into recognizing their misconceptions. But the real transformation had come through the slower work of rebuilding relationships on foundations of truth and mutual respect. Marcus would return to work Monday morning in my building, but now he would walk through those halls with a completely different understanding of success, security, and self-worth. Rebecca would continue her meaningful work helping families in crisis, but with a renewed appreciation for the values that had shaped her character. And I would continue tending my garden, managing my properties, and living according to principles that had served me well for 7 decades. The difference was that I was no longer doing it alone, no longer having my choices misunderstood or my values dismissed. The silence I had maintained for 3 years had finally been broken, not through anger or revenge, but through a revelation that taught my family to see beyond appearances to the substance beneath. As I cleaned up after dinner and prepared for another peaceful evening in my home, I smiled at the irony that had shaped this entire story. Marcus had spent years mocking his cheap mother-in-law, never knowing that his success depended on her investment, that his prestigious workplace was made possible by her business acumen, that his judgments revealed his own limitations rather than mine. The game had indeed changed, but not in the way any of us had expected. Instead of proving my worth through display or demanding recognition through confrontation, I had simply revealed the truth and allowed it to transform us all. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, achieved not through force, but through patience, not through anger, but through love, not through proving others wrong, but through helping them discover what's right. The story was complete, but the life it had revealed was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.